Are you ready to peel back the layers of history and gaze into the secluded world of medieval nuns? From the 6th to the 15th century? What secrets did their silent cloisters hold? How did these women, cloistered behind stone walls, transform their very beings into living prayers? Number 10. The sacred embrace of the divine office through embodied ritual. In the medieval world, especially within Benedictine convents, the divine office formed the heartbeat of daily life. It was not merely a series of prayers recited. It was a deeply physical and choreographed ritual, a total immersion of body and spirit. Nuns would gather 7 times a day and once in the night in the choir of their chapel, and each of these services, from matins before dawn to compline at the close of day, demanded a rigorous participation that went far beyond simply speaking the words. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monastic communities, meticulously outlined the structure of these hours, but individual convents developed their own unique interpretations, turning the office into a living, breathing performance of devotion. Picture a nun standing in the dimly lit choir, her plain habit blending with the shadows. When the abbess or prioress gave a signal, perhaps a gentle tap of a staff, every nun would execute a profound bow, not just a slight incline of the head, but a deep, almost contorted bend of the body. Their foreheads would often touch the cold stone floor, their arms extended, a physical representation of their humility and their submission to God. These deep bows were known as prostrations, and they were not a one-time gesture. They punctuated various parts of the office, particularly during the chanting of the Psalms or during moments of confession and penitence. For instance, during the penitential Psalms, a nun might remain prostrate for an extended period, her body pressed against the floor, feeling the chill of the stone seep through her wool habit. This was not about comfort. It was about stripping away worldly ease, embodying a profound sense of unworthiness before the divine. Beyond the prostrations, there were specific standing and sitting postures, each with its own spiritual significance. During the chanting of the gospel, all nuns would rise and stand erect, eyes often cast downwards in reverence, signifying their attentiveness to the sacred word. During the recitation of certain prayers or hymns, they might sit on the choir stalls, but even then their posture would remain rigid, their hands often folded in their laps or clasped in prayer. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and imbued with purpose. There was no fidgeting, no casual shifting of weight. The body became an instrument of prayer. Every muscle, every joint, aligned with the intention of worship. Consider the intricate hand gestures that accompanied the chanting. While not as elaborate as those in some later mystical traditions, medieval nuns often used subtle hand movements to emphasize certain words or phrases. A hand might rise slowly, palm open during a petition for grace, or clench gently during a prayer of sorrow. These small, almost imperceptible gestures were not for an audience. They were for the nun herself, to deepen her personal connection to the words she was uttering. They were a way of pouring her entire being into the vocalization, making the prayer resonate not just in the air, but within her very bones. The rhythm of the chanting itself was a form of physical prayer. The Gregorian chant, often sung in unison, required deep breath control and sustained vocalization. Nuns would train their voices to produce the pure ethereal tones that filled the monastic space, allowing the vibrations of the sound to permeate their bodies. This was not a performance in the modern sense. It was an act of offering. The very air, filled with their voices, became a conduit for their devotion. The ancient customary Avheimel of Halberstadt, a text detailing monastic practices, describes the precise manner of standing, sitting, and bowing, ensuring uniformity and discipline in these physical acts of worship. The nuns of Quedlinburg Abbey, for example, were known for their strict adherence to these detailed liturgical instructions, their movements almost perfectly synchronized, creating a seamless flow of embodied prayer. collective precision of their movements reinforced the communal aspect of their devotion, demonstrating their shared commitment and unity in their sacred duties. This physical rigor was a constant reminder of their vows, a continuous act of self-offering. Number 9. The prayer of silence and unspoken contemplation. While much of monastic life revolved around vocal prayer and structured liturgy, many medieval nuns also cultivated a deep, interior prayer of silence, a profound contemplation that went beyond spoken words. This practice was not about an absence of sound, but about a deliberate quieting of the mind, a striving for a direct, unmediated communion with the divine. It was often the culmination of intense spiritual discipline and ascetic practices, a journey inward to a place where words failed and only the soul could speak. The Cistercian order, known for its emphasis on austerity and solitude, particularly fostered this form of prayer. Nuns within Cistercian convents, such as the famous Abbey of Les Clercs, embraced a severe discipline of silence throughout their day. Beyond the necessary communications for work or during liturgical services, speech was strictly forbidden. This forced quietude was not an end in itself, but a means to an end, to clear the mind of worldly distractions and chatter, to make space for God. Imagine spending hours, days, even weeks in profound silence. Your only external sounds, the rustle of habits, the distant clang of a bell, or the faint whispers of nature outside the cloister walls. This enforced silence became a crucible for the soul, pushing the nun to confront her own thoughts, anxieties, and desires, and then to transcend them. The goal of the prayer of silence was unio mystica, mystical union with God. It was believed that human language, with its limitations and earthly connotations, could not fully capture the essence of the divine. Therefore, true prayer, in its highest form, transcended words entirely. Nuns engaged in this practice would spend long periods in their cells, in the chapter house, or within the chapel, not reciting prayers from a book, but simply being in the presence of God. This often involved a process of mental purification, emptying the mind of all thoughts and images, a process described by mystical writers like Walter Hilton in The Scale of Perfection, a text popular in English convents. A nun might focus on a single divine attribute like God's love or mercy, or simply on the presence of God within her own soul. This was not a passive state. It required immense mental discipline and spiritual energy. For some nuns, this silent contemplation was intertwined with specific physical postures. A nun might sit upright, completely still for hours, her hands resting gently, her gaze fixed on a crucifix or a simple wall. Others might kneel, their heads bowed, their bodies in a posture of complete surrender. The stillness of the body was seen as a reflection of the stillness of the mind, a preparation for the soul to receive divine grace. The Ankreen Wisa, a guide for anchoresses, frequently discusses the importance of interior silence and stillness, encouraging women to cultivate a deep inner quietness where they could listen for the voice of God. This inner silence was not merely passive. It was a form of active listening. Nuns believed that in the absence of their own words, God could speak to them. This might manifest as an inner knowing, a profound sense of peace, or even sudden bursts of spiritual insight. It was a space where the boundaries between the human and the divine seemed to dissolve, where the nun could experience a direct personal encounter with the sacred. Accounts from Carthusian nunneries, known for their extreme solitude, speak of nuns spending entire days in profound silence, broken only by the communal chanting of the divine office. This intense dedication to inner quietude was seen as a fast for the soul, as rigorous as any physical fast, aimed at purifying the inner landscape and opening it completely to the divine presence. The very air around them became a medium for their unspoken devotion, charged with the intensity of their spiritual striving. Number 8. The prayer of penance and self-mortification. For many medieval nuns, prayer was not solely an act of contemplation or vocalization. It was also a deeply physical engagement with suffering, a profound act of penance and self-mortification. This was understood not as self-hatred, but as a rigorous discipline aimed at purifying the soul, identifying with the suffering of Christ, and earning divine favor. Practice took many forms, from severe fasting and sleep deprivation to the deliberate infliction of pain. One of the most widely recorded forms of self-mortification was the wearing of hair shirts, or rough, uncomfortable garments beneath the hat. These shirts, made of coarse animal hair or stiff wool, would chafe against the skin, causing constant irritation and discomfort. They were worn day and night, during work, prayer, and sleep, a perpetual reminder of worldly vanity and the need for spiritual discipline. The Vita of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, though a queen, detailed her adoption of a hair shirt and other penitential practices, inspiring many devout women, including nuns, to follow suit. A nun might combine this with tightly bound cords or chains worn around the waist or limbs, pressing into the flesh, creating a continuous low-level pain that served as a constant prayer. These were not displayed. They were hidden beneath the religious habit known only to the individual nun and her confessor, a private sacrifice offered solely to God. Fasting was another cornerstone of penitential prayer. Beyond the prescribed fasts of the church calendar, many nuns undertook personal, more extreme fasts. This might involve abstaining from certain foods entirely, reducing meals to bare sustenance, or eating only bread and water for extended periods. Saint Colette of Corbie, a reformer of the Poor Clares, was known for her incredibly severe fasts, sometimes going for days without solid food, subsisting only on liquids. This was not merely about denying the body, it was about sharpening the mind and spirit, using hunger as a tool to focus intensely on God, to feel a small echo of Christ's suffering in the desert. The physical weakness brought on by fasting was seen as an opportunity for spiritual strength, a pathway to deeper prayer and heightened spiritual sensitivity. Sleep deprivation was also a common penitential practice. While monastic rules prescribed a certain amount of sleep, many devout nuns would purposefully reduce their hours of rest, rising early for additional prayers or staying up late for vigils. They might sleep on the bare floor or on a simple wooden plank rather than a comfortable bed, further denying the body its ease. This self-imposed lack of sleep was believed to keep the mind alert for God, preventing the dullness that comes with excessive comfort. It was a constant fight against the desires of the flesh, a perpetual state of spiritual readiness. Perhaps the most dramatic form of penitential prayer was self-flagellation. While often associated with male ascetics, many nuns also practiced it in private. Using small whips or disciplines, they would strike their own backs or shoulders, usually with a specific number of blows, often while reciting psalms or prayers of repentance. The life of Christina of Margate, an English anchoress who lived a monastic life, recounts her intense use of self-flagellation as a means to purify herself and draw closer to Christ. This painful act was a stark reminder of Christ's scourging, a physical participation in his passion. It was an act of offering a tangible demonstration of sorrow for sins and a fervent plea for divine mercy. The wounds inflicted were seen not as signs of weakness, but as badges of spiritual warfare, a testament to the nuns' unwavering dedication to a life of radical self-denial for God. The sting of each blow was intended to focus the mind, to burn away distractions, and to sharpen the nun's spiritual intention, making her prayers intensely fervent. Number 7. Prayer through artistic creation and illumination. For some medieval nuns, prayer was not confined to spoken words or physical postures. It flowed directly from their hands and minds into the creation of beautiful objects and illuminated manuscripts. The act of artistic creation became a form of sustained meditation, a visual prayer offered to God with every brushstroke, every careful stitch, every gilded letter. In convents across Europe, especially those with strong traditions of scholarship and craft, like the Benedictine Abbey of Admont in Austria or the convent of Gandersheim in Saxony, nuns dedicated countless hours to the meticulous labor of producing sacred art. One of the most significant artistic prayer practices was the illumination of manuscripts, particularly Bibles, psalters, and books of hours. This was an extraordinarily time-consuming process. A nun's scriptorium might spend months, even years, copying sacred texts by hand, letter by perfect letter, ensuring absolute accuracy. But the prayer did not stop. Once the text was copied, the true artistic devotion began. Using finely ground pigments made from minerals, plants, and even precious stones, the nun illuminator would paint intricate miniatures, ornate borders, and initial letters that blossomed with vibrant color and gold leaf. Each stroke of the brush, each careful application of gold, was a deliberate act of worship. Consider the detailed work involved. To create a single illuminated letter, a nun might first sketch the design, then apply a layer of gesso, a plaster-like substance, to build up a raised surface. On this gesso, she would carefully lay thin sheets of gold leaf, burnishing them until they gleamed with a celestial light. Only then would she begin to paint the intricate details of a vine, a flower, a bird, or a miniature scene from the life of Christ or a saint. While working, her mind would be focused on the sacred text she was beautifying, her hands translating her devotion into tangible form. Each detail was a silent prayer, each color chosen for its symbolic meaning, each golden highlight a representation of divine glory. The Admont Antiphonary, a collection of chants and hymns, is a testament to the stunning artistry of the nuns at Admont, its pages bursting with intricate designs and gilded letters, each a physical embodiment of their deep spiritual concentration. Beyond manuscript illumination, nuns also engaged in liturgical embroidery and weaving. Creating vestments for priests, altar cloths, and hangings for the chapel was another avenue for artistic prayer. Imagine a nun bent over a frame, her needle moving rhythmically, stitching threads of silk and gold into elaborate patterns of saint symbols and biblical scenes. This was not mere decorative work. It was an act of preparing the sacred space, of clothing the liturgy in beauty. Each stitch was a prayer for the priest who would wear the vestment, for the salvation of souls, for the glory of God. The physical act of repetitive, focused handwork lent itself to a meditative state, allowing the nun to enter a deep state of prayer while her hands were busy. The creation of sacred objects, like reliquaries or small devotional figures, also served as a prayer practice. Nuns might fashion small carvings from wood or ivory or sculpt figures from clay, always with the intention of fostering devotion. These objects, once completed, would often be placed in their cells or in the chapel, serving as aids to personal prayer and contemplation. The act of creation itself was a profound spiritual journey, transforming raw materials into vessels of divine meaning. For the nuns of Gandersheim, known for their skill in metalwork and embroidery, the creation of sacred adornments for the altar and liturgical books was seen as a direct offering, the craftsmanship a mirror of God's own creative power. The time, precision, and devotion invested in these artistic endeavors were themselves forms of prayer, making the convent a vibrant center of creative worship. Number 6. Prayer for the dead and perpetual intercession. The medieval world was deeply preoccupied with death, salvation, and the afterlife. For nuns, this meant that a significant portion of their prayer life was dedicated to intercession for the dead, a perpetual spiritual service aimed at aiding souls in purgatory and honoring deceased benefactors and community members. This was far more than a casual remembrance. It was a highly organized, systematic, and continuous act of devotion that shaped the very rhythm of monastic life. Every convent maintained a necrology, or memorial book, a register listing the names of all deceased nuns, abbesses, benefactors, and often their families who had contributed to the convent's existence or whose salvation was particularly desired. Each day during the divine office, specific names from this book would be read aloud, and the community would pray for their souls. This ensured that no one was forgotten, that a continuous stream of prayer flowed from the living community to the departed. The necrology of Reichenau Abbey, a monastery with which some nunneries were affiliated, provided a model for these detailed records, demonstrating the importance of remembrance. Beyond these daily readings, specific anniversaries of deaths were marked with special solemnity. On the anniversary of an abbess's death, for example, the community would often observe a stricter fast, perform additional psalms, and offer special masses and vigils. The entire day would be dedicated to remembering and interceding for her soul. This was not merely about honoring the deceased. It was about the profound belief that the prayers of the living could shorten a soul's time in purgatory, speeding its journey to heaven. The nuns saw themselves as spiritual midwives, aiding souls in their passage to eternal rest. The act of intercessory prayer for the dead often involved specific dietary practices. In some convents, a portion of the daily meal, or even an entire meal, might be symbolically offered for the dead. This could involve setting aside a plate of food, giving it to the poor in the name of the deceased, or simply foregoing a portion of their own food as a sacrifice for the benefit of a departed soul. This connected the physical act of sustenance with the spiritual act of intercession, transforming a mundane necessity into a sacred offering. The consuetudines of the Cistercian order, for instance, contained detailed instructions for remembering the dead at meal times. Furthermore, the convent chapel itself became a central place for this perpetual remembrance. Chapels often contained tombs of former abbesses or significant benefactors, and nuns would frequently pause by these tombs, offering individual prayers for the souls resting within. The very stones of the convent were imbued with the memory of those who had gone before, making the entire sacred space a living memorial. In some cases, arrangements were made for perpetual prayers, where a specific nun or a rotating group of nuns would be designated to continuously pray for a particular deceased person or family line, ensuring that the intercession never ceased. This constant prayer for the dead was also a reminder to the living nuns of their own mortality and the importance of preparing for their own death. It fostered a deep communal bond, extending beyond life into the realm of the eternal. The nuns understood themselves as part of a larger, timeless community of saints, both living and dead, and their intercessory prayers were a vital link in this celestial chain. Practice underscored a profound sense of responsibility and solidarity, a conviction that the spiritual well-being of the departed depended in part on the unwavering dedication of the living. Number 5. The Living Crucifix, Devotion, and Embodied Passion. One of the most intense and visually striking prayer practices among some medieval nuns, particularly within mystical traditions, was the Living Crucifix devotion. This was not merely contemplation of the Passion of Christ, but a profound attempt to physically and emotionally embody his suffering, to become a living representation of the crucified Jesus. This practice often involved prolonged painful postures, self-inflicted wounds, and an overwhelming identification with the agony of the cross. For certain highly devout nuns, especially among the Beguines or Cistercian mystics, the suffering of Christ was not an abstract concept. It was a deeply felt, almost tangible reality. They desired not just to understand the Passion, but to experience it in their own bodies. This often began with intense meditation on the details of the crucifixion, the nails, the crown of thorns, the spear wound, the thirst, the agony. They would spend hours, even days, dwelling on these images, allowing the emotional and spiritual pain to wash over them. The physical manifestation of this devotion could be extreme. Some nuns would adopt specific agonizing postures for extended periods, mimicking the position of Christ on the cross. This might involve lying prostrate with arms outstretched in a cross-like shape, or remaining on their knees with arms held wide for hours on end, until their muscles ached and their limbs grew numb. Pain became part of the prayer, a tangible connection to the pain of Christ. Accounts of women like Marie of Oignies describe her intense physical manifestations of devotion, including prolonged prostrations and weeping during prayer. Further amplifying this embodied suffering, some mystics experienced stigmatization, the spontaneous appearance of the wounds of Christ on their own bodies. While rare and often debated, these phenomena were seen by some as the ultimate sign of divine favor and profound identification with Christ's passion. Whether through miraculous means or through their own ascetic practices that led to physical manifestations, these women were seen as carrying the very marks of Christ's suffering, making their bodies a living testament to their devotion. The wounds themselves became a constant visible prayer, beyond the adoption of specific postures or the experience of stigmata. Nuns practicing the Living Crucifix devotion would often engage in intense empathetic suffering. They would feel a burning desire to share Christ's pain, to suffer alongside him. This could lead to periods of profound emotional distress, intense weeping, and even physical illness as their bodies responded to the intensity of their spiritual identification. They might intentionally deprive themselves of comfort, warmth, or food, seeing every discomfort as a small, shared agony with Christ. The goal was a complete surrender, a dissolving of their own identity into the suffering Christ. By becoming the living crucifix, the nun believed she could participate directly in the redemptive act, offering her own pain in union with Christ's for the salvation of the world. This was a radical form of intercessory prayer, where the nun's very body became a conduit for divine mercy. This intense, often painful identification was considered a mark of profound spiritual advancement, a sign of a soul consumed by divine love and a yearning for ultimate union. The accounts in the Vitae of many saints often detailed these extreme forms of physical devotion, providing models for other pious women to follow. Number 4. The prayer of bridal mysticism and effective union. Among the most captivating and intensely personal prayer practices of medieval nuns was bridal mysticism, an effective devotion that viewed the soul as the bride of Christ. This was not a mere metaphor. It was a profound spiritual reality that shaped their inner lives, their prayers, and their understanding of their relationship with the divine. Nuns who embraced this mysticism often described their communion with God in terms of a passionate, intimate, and often ecstatic love affair, using the language of human courtship, betrothal, and marriage to articulate their spiritual experiences. The roots of bridal mysticism lie deep in scriptural texts, particularly the Song of Songs, which was widely interpreted allegorically as a dialogue between Christ and the soul, or Christ and the Church. Nuns would meditate deeply on these verses, imagining themselves as the beloved bride, yearning for her divine groom. This gave their prayers a distinctive quality of yearning, longing, and intense personal affection. The Cistercian mystics, such as Mechild of Magdeburg and Hedwig of Antwerp, were prominent proponents of this form of prayer, their writings brimming with vivid, often audacious descriptions of their intimate encounters with God. In this prayer practice, the nun would cultivate a deep emotional connection with Christ. She would speak to him as a lover, expressing her adoration, her longing, her sorrows, and her joys with unrestrained passion. This was not formal liturgical prayer, but a highly personal and spontaneous outpouring of the heart. Her prayers might take the form of fervent desires for spiritual union, or expressions of joy at a perceived divine presence, or even laments of separation and absence, mirroring the emotional highs and lows of human love. The flowing light of the Godhead by Mechthild of Magdeburg is filled with such intimate dialogues, where she describes spiritual embraces, kisses, and intense emotional exchanges with Christ. The concept of spiritual marriage was central. Many nuns understood their monastic vows as a literal betrothal to Christ, taking on a spiritual wedding ring and veil. Their daily life became a continuous preparation for this ultimate union. Their prayers were often petitions for Christ to reveal himself more fully, to draw them closer into his embrace. They might envision elaborate celestial wedding feasts or personal encounters in their cells where Christ would appear to them as their divine spouse. This transformed the often solitary and austere monastic life into a romantic spiritual adventure. For these nuns, prayer was not just an intellectual exercise, it was an affair of the heart, a profoundly effective experience. They would experience intense feelings of divine love, often accompanied by physical sensations, warmth, tingling, or even a sense of being overwhelmed by an ineffable sweetness. Tears of joy or sorrow were common, seen as signs of deep spiritual emotion. The entire body, mind, and spirit were engaged in this intimate communion. The visions of Bridget of Sweden, while encompassing broader prophetic elements, also contain moments of profound personal intimacy with Christ, reflecting this bridal devotion. This form of prayer provided a rich emotional landscape for nuns, allowing them to experience a profound sense of belovedness and direct spiritual connection, transforming their daily existence into a courtship with the divine. Number 3. Relic veneration and corporeal prayer. In the medieval period, relics, physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, were considered potent conduits of divine power. For nuns, prayer, in the presence of, or through direct physical interaction with relics, was a unique and intense practice, transforming abstract devotion into a tangible, corporeal experience. Convents often housed significant collections of relics, and nuns would engage in highly ritualized and personal forms of prayer with these sacred objects. The mere presence of relics within the convent chapel or a special reliquary chamber was believed to sanctify the entire space, making it particularly conducive to prayer. Nuns would regularly visit these reliquaries, kneeling before them, offering their prayers, and asking for intercession. This was a communal practice during liturgical processions, where relics might be carried through the cloister, prompting nuns to kneel, bow, and offer silent prayers as they passed. But it was also a deeply personal one. A nun might spend private hours before a shrine containing the bone of a saint, feeling a profound connection to that holy individual and through them, to God. The inventories of Sainte-Chapelle, a renowned reliquary chapel, reflect the vast number of relics revered, a practice that extended to convents. Beyond merely praying before relics, some nuns engaged in direct physical interaction, a form of corporeal prayer. This could involve kissing the reliquary, touching the object with their hands, or even pressing their foreheads against the sacred container. The belief was that grace and healing power could emanate from the relic through physical contact. This was not a detached observation. It was an intimate, sensory encounter. A nun might gently hold a small, enshrined relic in her hands, her fingers tracing its contours, her eyes fixed on its form, her breath slowing as she felt the tangible presence of the sacred. The act of holding, touching, and kissing the relic became a form of prayer in itself, a way of drawing the divine power into her own body and soul. In some extreme instances, particularly for those seeking spiritual healing or profound purification, nuns might even drink water that had been in contact with a relic or use oils that had touched a saint's tomb. This was a rare but documented practice, driven by a deep conviction in the physical efficacy of holy objects. The life of Saint Clara of Assisi describes the reverence she had for sacred objects and how they could be used to foster devotion and healing. The physical body of the nun became part of the prayer, a vessel to receive and transmit divine grace through direct interaction with holy matter. Prayer with relics was not just about asking for things, it was also about identification and emulation. By praying with the relics of a specific saint, a nun sought to absorb some of that saint's virtues, to follow their example, and to draw closer to the holiness they embodied. For example, a nun struggling with humility might spend hours praying before a relic of Saint Benedict, asking for his intercession and strength to overcome her own pride. The relic served as a tangible link to the communion of saints, a reminder that she was part of a larger heavenly host and that the prayers of the saints could bolster her own spiritual efforts. The physical presence of the relic grounded her abstract beliefs in a concrete reality, making her prayer intensely focused and powerfully felt. Number 2. Visionary prayer and prophetic intercession. For certain medieval nuns, prayer transcended conventional forms, becoming a direct conduit for divine communication through visions, prophecies, and ecstatic experiences. These women, often known as mystics or visionaries, structured their entire spiritual lives around these direct encounters with the divine, transforming their personal prayers into prophetic intercession for their communities and the wider world. Their experiences were not passive observations. They were active, sometimes overwhelming, interactions that demanded specific responses and often led to the composition of intricate theological and spiritual texts. Perhaps the most famous example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century Benedictine abbess. From a young age, Hildegard experienced profound visions which she understood to be direct revelations from God. Her prayer life was characterized by a deep attunement to these inner lights and voices. When a vision began, she would enter a state of heightened awareness, often accompanied by physical sensations, and would then strive to transcribe what she saw and heard. This act of recording, often with the help of a scribe, was itself a form of prayer, a faithful obedience to the divine command to reveal God's mysteries. Her major work, Scivia's Know the Ways, is a comprehensive record of her visions, presented as a divinely inspired instruction for humanity. Hildegard's visionary prayer was not just for her own spiritual benefit. Her visions often contained prophetic messages, warnings, and calls for reform, directed at popes, emperors, and monastic leaders. Her prayers, therefore, extended beyond personal contemplation to active prophetic intercession. She would pray for the church, for the salvation of souls, and for the moral uprightness of society, and her visions provided the framework and content for these prayers. She believed that God was speaking through her, and her duty was to faithfully transmit these divine messages, often risking censure or disbelief. Her letters, preserved in extensive collections, show her directly addressing powerful figures, her arguments often framed by the authority of her visions, demonstrating how her prayer life spilled over into bold public advocacy. Other visionaries, such as Bridget of Sweden, a 14th century mystic and founder of the Brigittine order, also lived a life centered on visionary prayer. Bridget's extensive revelations recount her conversations with Christ, the Virgin Mary, and various saints, which often dictated specific prayers, spiritual exercises, and even the architectural layout for her future monastic order. Her prayer was a continuous dialogue, a constant state of receiving divine instruction and then acting upon it. She spent countless hours in intense prayer, often accompanied by weeping or ecstatic states, to induce these visions and to faithfully record their content. For Bridget, prayer was an interactive process of divine communication where her role was to listen, to understand, and to articulate God's will to the world. These nuns did not just have visions, they lived their visions as a form of prayer. The content of their visions shaped their daily liturgical practices, their personal devotions, and their intercessory prayers for the world. They were not merely praying to God, they were praying with God, receiving divine knowledge and actively participating in the unfolding of God's plan through their direct, often overwhelming, spiritual encounters. Their visionary prayer transformed them into powerful intermediaries, their insights and prophecies serving as a unique and often challenging form of intercession. Number 1. The cultivation of the interior monastery and prayer of the heart. The most profound and unique prayer practice cultivated by medieval nuns, especially those embracing contemplative or anchoritic lives, was the cultivation of the interior monastery and the practice of the prayer of the heart. This was a radical shift from external rituals to an internal spiritual dwelling place, where God was met not in a physical building but within the deepest recesses of the soul. It was a striving for continuous prayer, not just during set hours but in every moment of existence, transforming the nun's very being into a living prayer. For anchoresses, women who chose to be voluntarily enclosed in a small cell attached to a church like Julian of Norwich, this interiorization was paramount. Their physical enclosure mirrored their spiritual focus. The world outside was shut away, allowing the entire universe of their devotion to shrink to the space within their own hearts. The Convey, a widely circulated guide for anchoresses, meticulously outlines how to cultivate this interior life. It emphasizes not just physical isolation, but a rigorous mental and spiritual discipline to silence worldly thoughts and create a pure space for God. The prayer of the heart, while known in various traditions, found a unique expression among these nuns. It was not about reciting long litanies or intricate theological arguments. Instead, it was about a simple, ceaseless turning of the heart and mind towards God. This often involved the repetitive invocation of a short, powerful prayer, such as the Jesus Prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. The repetition was not rote. It was a means to quiet the mind, to move beyond intellectual thought, and to sink into a deeper level of consciousness where the divine presence could be felt directly. The rhythm of the breath would often be synchronized with the prayer, making the very act of living a continuous act of worship. The interior monastery concept meant that a nun viewed her own soul as a sacred dwelling place, a spiritual replica of the physical cloister, complete with its own chapel and a chapter house and refectory, all existing within her. In this interior space, she could perpetually commune with God, regardless of her external circumstances. This allowed for an unbroken state of prayer, even while engaged in manual labor, eating, or sleeping. Every thought, every feeling, every action was offered to God from this sacred inner sanctuary. This transformed mundane tasks into acts of devotion. Peeling vegetables could become a prayer of humility, weaving cloth a prayer of patience. Julian of Norwich's revelations of divine love beautifully exemplifies this interior journey. Her entire spiritual experience, including her visions of Christ's suffering and love, took place within the confines of her small cell and more profoundly within her interior landscape. She didn't seek external confirmation or dramatic public displays. Her prayer was a deep, sustained contemplation of God's unconditional love, explored within the quiet solitude of her heart. She found the entire cosmos, the mystery of salvation, and the boundless love of God contained within herself, demonstrating the ultimate realization of the interior monastery. This constant cultivation of the interior monastery and the prayer of the heart was not an easy path. It required extraordinary self-awareness, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to inner solitude. But for these nuns, it was the ultimate form of prayer, a continuous act of being in God's presence, transforming their very existence into a perpetual act of worship. Their interior lives became their primary mission, their hearts their holiest sanctuary, and their every breath a silent offering to the divine.